O God, our help in ages past, our hope for years to come, our shelter from the stormy blast.
Welcome to the King's Hand in History podcast. I'm Chris Van Dusen.
And I'm Casey Hoost, and we're here to proclaim the King's glorious deeds.
All right, today in this episode, we are discussing the nation of Great Britain and the British Empire during the 1800s. Since we've already just discussed the United States, we decided to go to the other nation that was thoroughly influenced by Christianity during this time, and a lot of historians would consider the 19th century, the 1800s, to be the evangelical century. That in this time, that's when evangelicalism, Protestant biblical Christianity, really flourished in the English-speaking world, and the gospel went forth to many places. Institutions were established, social institutions, society was reformed. You really see this in Great Britain, in England, in Wales, in Scotland, and a little bit in Ireland as well as in the other British colonies, such as India and in Africa. I can't think of any others. But in spite of the fact that during the 1800s there was a huge revival, not a spiritual revival, but a revival of Enlightenment, humanistic ideas, rationalism.
Yeah, I'd say that's when the Industrial Revolution really took off, and you see scientific advancement going at a level that's never been seen before.
Right. Not only scientific advancement, but advancement in unbelief, in secularism. Right?
Yeah, we'll definitely be talking about that.
Right. I mean, that did happen in England as well. But thankfully, because there was such a biblical Christian influence in Great Britain, it pretty much, for the most part, in the 1800s, there were the Christian values and beliefs and morality was widespread among the population, and it actually increased in contrast to Central Europe, where you see atheism, you see humanism, basically advancing to a greater degree, and eventually, I think that really flowered and served as an impetus and a catalyst for communism in the 1900s. The rationalism, the humanism in the 1800s.
Although I will say the Communist Manifesto was written 1848 by Marx, specifically with London in mind. He was living in London, and seeing the circumstances in London between the classes was his what spurred him on to write that, and to think the class differences and the class struggle as communism was the way. Was in London in like the 1840s.
Right. Although he wasn't that popular at first.
No.
Right? Yeah. So in this episode, we're going to focus on the Christianity of Great Britain and its empire. But in order to do that, we need to get the background in the beginning of the century, in the start of the 1800s, of what was going on with the nation of Great Britain. In the 1700s, as we've already discussed in previous episodes, there was a great revival that went alongside the First Great Awakening in the United States. It's called the First Great Awakening in the United States because there was a Second Great Awakening in the United States. But in Great Britain, the First Great Awakening, the preaching and revivals that were mainly brought about through the Methodist preachers, that in England it was called the Evangelical Revival, not the First Great Awakening, because they didn't have a quote-unquote Second Great Awakening. Although I think we can see in the 1800s there was kind of a general Great Awakening, as you see the expansion of Christianity, the growth of biblical Christianity, as well as the growth of pseudo-Christianity and anti-Christian ideas. But So that was the spiritual background of the 1800s in Great Britain. That you in the mid 1700s you see Methodism arise through the leadership of John and Charles Wesley, as well as George Whitefield at the beginning. And Methodism, which was actually a movement that was inside of the Anglican Church, it had a great effect on society. So we have to remember that Great Britain had a national state church, the Anglican Church, and so most people were expected to attend that church.
Yeah, you were actually, when you were born, you were put down as Anglican, like on their state rolls or whatever, unless you specified different. And if you said you were atheist or whatever, they just put Anglican. Anything that was like nondescript equals Anglican to them.
Right.
Yeah, go ahead.
But just underline the importance of the Anglican Church, even in the 1800s, unless you had to be a member of the Anglican Church in order to hold positions of high government office, or even to go to a university to earn a degree.
And I believe there was I don't know if tax was the word they used, or whether it was tax or a fee. If you weren't an Anglican, you had to pay I forget what it was, because they figured you weren't paying the tithe that was required of everybody else.
Yeah.
So you had to pay this towards the state or the Anglican Church for not being an Anglican.
Right, and then we have to remember that the Anglican Church at this time was still a part of the, well, I believe it still is now, but even more so back then, it was a part of the government.
Yeah.
It was a government, state-run church. Queen Victoria, who is the most important I guess, figurehead of government in Great Britain at the time, she was a devout Anglican, I believe.
She was,
at least in name, she was the head of the Anglican Church.
She did have influences. Her husband was a German, and he was a Lutheran.
Oh, okay.
And then also, her and her husband fell in love with Scotland, and actually would go there for long stretches and live there. And so she did have a soft spot for Presbyterians.
Interesting.
But yes, because she was the queen and that was proper, she was Anglican.
Right, because the monarch of the country was officially the head of the church, unfortunately. But, okay, so the Anglican Church is big in this time, but you also have, you had the rise of the Methodists in the 1700s, and those were former Anglicans, and actually a lot of people broke off from the Anglican Church, depriving the Anglican Church of members to become Methodists and to form these Methodist societies. And so a lot of the former Anglicans were now what is called nonconformists. They were not conforming to the Anglican churches. And also the revival in the 1700s, I believe, also inspired the other nonconformist denominations, like the Baptists and in small part the Presbyterians and the Congregationalists and Quakers as well, to basically I guess make further progress in their own preaching, their own church growth. And so in the late 1700s, to give an example of this, there was a group of Baptist churches in England that got together, and with one of their leaders being William Carey, who he was a businessman and he was a language expert who actually learned other languages on his own, several different languages, in order to become a missionary, and he dreamed to become a missionary to India. And he along with other Baptist leaders got together and they formed what was called the Baptist Missionary Society. They started it off with just praying, and then they worked toward raising funds to send someone to India to preach the gospel. And he gave a famous sermon called "Expect Great Things from God, Attempt Great Things for God" to them. And he was sent off to India in the late 1700s. For 7 years, he was in India without having anyone believe the gospel, and finally, someone believed the gospel, and he began to start a church and to translate the Bible into their language, and the gospel was planted in India, a British colony. So you have the Baptists growing in this time period, the Methodists growing as well, and then also, so economically, this is in this late 1700s was the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, right, Casey?
Yeah, I'd say I'd say probably that's when it was starting. It really took off in the a little bit into the 1800s. And I would also say, importantly, England was the first country to be industrialized.
Yeah.
That they preceded everyone. I'd say America and Germany caught up pretty quick, but that England was the first. And so you see, even in their colonization and thus also in their missionary work, that they, because of their technological advances, when they go places, they always win. I mean, we're talking places where they march into a jungle and they've got 18 men and an army of 5,000 comes out against them and they win. And they don't lose a person. And so then we get places like India, China. When I say China, I'm thinking like Hong Kong and the port cities. They didn't have much interest in going deep into China. They were, speaking of which, they were mostly interested in trade. They weren't looking for vast expanses of land.
In China, or just in general?
So
in their expansion.
I would say in general, but if it behooved them, like India was very rich in. They used it for cotton during the American Civil War. They used it for opium to sell to China. So like if it's a place where you can grow things, then we want the land. But for China, they're just trading it to them.
Right.
We just need a few ports to trade it. We don't want to like get involved all in that.
Yeah.
So trade was their main. Motive behind the empire. They weren't just trying to build like this big area where they controlled everybody. They just wanted trade to get wealthy, and they were very wealthy.
Right. It was probably the wealthiest country in Europe, correct?
In the world, yeah.
It was the largest empire. Excuse me, at least the largest European empire at the time.
Yeah.
In the beginning of the 1800s, it was the superpower of the Western world.
Yeah.
Right.
I mean, because they have, like we said, India, China, Australia, South Africa, Canada at this time, not to mention countless other smaller areas. We think of like in the Caribbean, they had several spots.
Right.
But yeah, so they had things going all over. And like I said, it was largely for trade. They had this all worked out. Part of the theory, it was mercantilism that was still going on, where it was, we developed these places for good trade for us. It wasn't a trade so much with other places. It's let's figure out how to trade within ourselves, how to produce the goods in our colonies and bring them here, and then we can process them and trade them to our colonies and end up with a lot of money, basically.
So they just another thing that leads us up to the beginning of the 1800s is the end of the American Revolution. So they just conceded to the Americans to give up those colonies to them. But this allows them to focus on France, because in the beginning of the 1800s, they are now I believe they are now in war.
Yeah,
a major war, the beginning of the Napoleonic Wars, right, with France. In the beginning of the 1800s.
Yeah, so I would say, well, the American Revolution wasn't, as far as the British were concerned, it was over before the whole thing in France happened.
Right.
In 1789 was when the revolution started, and France was just like a mess.
The French Revolution.
The French Revolution. France was just kind of a mess. There was the Reign of Terror, where you're trying to get all the nobles out before they get killed. And it wasn't until, I'm trying to remember, I think Napoleon may have taken over in 1799. But so it was then suddenly when Napoleon takes over that instead of just France being a mess, suddenly there's rapid expansion outside of France. They're expanding into Eastern Europe, and England is their enemy, and they're fighting basically a war for like 15 years. And because Napoleon was so successful, he basically took over the continent.
Right.
That they're just kind of trying
Central Europe.
Yeah, just trying to survive.
Except for Russia.
Yeah, though he did push pretty far into Russia.
Right.
But was
at great cost.
Yes, he did. Yes, he did. And so for 15 years up until 1815, we're talking all out war on France in 1815 the Duke of Wellington led the British forces in Waterloo. Well, Waterloo. And Napoleon was defeated.
Yeah.
And so coming out of that, looking ahead into the 1800s, this is very remembered. The Duke of Wellington actually plays a huge role in British politics for the next 30 years, and we see they have this feeling of military, like they're the best. Yeah, and which is kind of funny because they actually, for the next probably till they fight a lot of smaller wars.
Right.
They don't fight
any major
wars, and they're not that good at the smaller wars either.
Except for the imperial wars that they fight against natives. Right?
Yeah,
because they're constantly fighting against natives.
Yeah, I guess I should say against the natives. It's like when in the Opium War against China in like about 1840, their strategy was literally they'd pull up a ship to a port, they'd bomb it for 10 minutes, kill a whole bunch of people, everybody would flee, and they'd be like, "We can do this whenever we want. Like, are you done?" And China would be like, "No," and then they do it to another port, and then it'd be like, "All right, we're done. We'll sign a peace treaty." So like that was the war.
Yeah.
But as far as actually fighting on the ground, like in the Crimean War, sorry, I said that wrong. Which they did win, but you see there's a lot of nepotism, a lot of incompetency. They don't really have a good military plan. But yes, they did have this feeling of superiority, that we are the greatest army in the world, we can't be beaten. So that's just kind of going into the 1800s for them.
And also they had a feeling that they were the most prosperous nation in the world.
Yeah.
And that there was a huge uptick in wealth among people, and also an increase in the number of middle class people, right? In the 1800s.
I would say as far as wealth.
Also to add to that, a huge increase in the population of poor.
Yeah,
really poor people.
I was gonna say that was like when you think of the English society at this time, it was definitely marked by class difference.
Right.
That you can think of Victorian England as this beautiful, gaudy type of upper class. That's all about looking the part, and almost kind of reminded me a little bit of the Gilded Age. I mean, they like obviously they have the money behind them, but that it's all showy. And then a lot of times, because England is fairly small for their booming population at this point, 100 yards down or 100 meters, I should say, we're talking English, down the road, there's a slum.
Right.
From like these beautiful palaces. And yes, the large percentage of the population was very, very poor and very, very mistreated. And when I say mistreated, I mean more like in these factories they're working in, they're obviously they're the first country to have these things where they're going like coal mining, dock building, the textile industry, and probably a lot more that I'm thinking of.
Right.
There's no rules for regulating it, and they're sending little children, women, obviously men too, into terrible conditions,
right,
with big machinery that nobody's ever worked for, that a little slip up kills you.
Right. And the buildings probably are built so that they can use is the least amount of space possible.
Yeah.
Right. So you have confined spaces.
Yeah.
Also, you have poor ventilation. In these places.
And then like London at the time, and largely parts of England, were maybe some of the most polluted places in the history of the world. That they are all burning coal, that there are no regulations on anything. It's just like and there were certain districts where everything was black. It's just completely covered in soot. All the people too. And of the poor class, you weren't going to live to old age. I remember hearing a story about, think of like drinking water. The people that lived near the River Thames would go put a bucket into the River Thames, let it sit for a day or two, so that all the gunk and sediment would go to the bottom, and then drink off the top of that. Like that was their drinking water. Also, I would say it's important that farms, a move away from rural to urban, as they have all these things, all these factories to work at, but also as the landlords. The people who actually own the land, think of like back, it was like more like peasant serf situation. They realize they can make more money by enclosing it and doing like large like sheep, for textiles, and just have like a few people to look after the sheep.
Yeah.
And so all these like little farmers are kicked off the land, and so then they go to work in the factories, on the railroads. Oh yeah, railroads were a big thing. I forgot about that.
Yeah.
And so they go into the cities, and you get just these masses of really, really poor people that are really struggling. And we do see though a lot of Christian work in those areas too, though.
Christian work, right? So not only like not only grassroots Christian movements, but also you see a lot in the 1800s that there are leaders, Christian leaders, who lead the charge in politics to bring reforms to these things. Especially, I'm not sure who the leaders were that pushed for labor reforms. Besides in the late 1800s with the Salvation Army, but I do know there's one major figure named William Wilberforce, who he became a politician, I believe, in the late 1700s. He was a member of English Parliament, and he was one of the leading figures in pushing for the abolition of slavery, or the slave trade.
Both.
Right.
There wasn't much slavery in Britain, but there was slavery in some of their colonies.
Right.
So yeah, he was,
and there was still the slave trade up until it was abolished in the 1830s.
I think it was 1833.
Yeah, that sounds right.
Yeah.
So William Wilberforce was a devout Anglican Christian.
Yeah.
He was a Bible believing Christian. He founded his policy, his policies, his behavior in Parliament upon his Christian faith. So also, or were you going to say something?
I was going to say with the political movement for labor rights, there was also, looking back at the French Revolution, they were very aware that if the people get unhappy enough and revolt, we're in trouble.
Right.
And so, in the French Revolution actually had, 1815 is when Napoleon lost, but then they kept having little mini revolutions.
Mm-hmm.
I think like 1830, 1848, 1870. And so as they're seeing this, they realize like we have to give these people some rights, because it's better to do that now and still be, not have them rise up than to just completely oppress them and then be overthrown.
Mm-hmm. In connection with William Wilberforce, there was a wealthy lady, who began to help the poor in rural communities near. I'm guessing it was near London. I could be wrong. It could be another major city. Her name was Hannah More, and she had a sister, and they founded a society, an organization where they would go to a rural community and educate the poor people, and also provide them with opportunities for jobs. In the early 1800s, William Wilberforce was a close friend of her as well. And aside from that, you have Queen Victoria, who became queen in the 30s.
1837.
Yes, and she is a devout Christian believer, correct?
Oh, yes.
At least at some point. At least at some point.
Some of her theological statements are interesting, but yeah, she was definitely had faith.
So she certainly had. She was pro Bible, pro Christianity.
Yeah, and she was. So at this point, the queen, it is a constitutional monarchy. She doesn't have a lot of power at this point,
right?
But she still has a lot of influence,
right?
For instance, if she tells a lot of the lords and the prime minister to get something done, like they feel quite a bit of pressure because the queen just asked them to get this done,
mm-hmm.
but she doesn't actually have the power to do it. But yeah, she is very what's the word for it? But when she hears about these different causes, she definitely thinks things should be done about them, mm-hmm. and feels empathy towards the poor classes, even towards the peoples in the different colonies, the different people groups that are sometimes mistreated by the British, mm-hmm. and she speaks out about it.
Yeah, speaking of causes, it was not just anti-slavery causes and labor reform causes, but there was also a temperance movement. I think that began more in the late 1800s in Britain, especially with the Salvation Army.
Yeah. Oh, and that was actually connected to what we were talking about with the rural people moving to the factory life. That especially the first generation that moved from rural to urban and was dealing with these harsh conditions, was alcohol became a big crutch for a lot of these people.
Right. And
that it was in the society, it was completely acceptable to abuse your spouse. Mm-hmm. If you're a man, to beat your wife. This was not obviously that people liked it, but that it was acceptable. It mm-hmm. happened, and so the temperance movement was kind of partially born out of this, seeing that like everybody drinks, and there's a lot of angry drunks out there, and it's acceptable. Like we can't let that be.
Right. So.
Oh, I did want to mention too. George Mueller was another.
Late 1800s.
He started. Oh, I think he started. He died, I think, in the 1880s, but he did it for a lot of years. Mm-hmm. So I think he was right through the mid 1800s. But just another. I shouldn't say just another. An excellent example to us, where he started an orphanage, I think, in Bristol, to take in all these kids that otherwise would be scooped up by different factory owners, to just basically put them down in the mines or wherever, and have them work terrible places where a lot of them would die.
Yeah.
And he did these orphanage and taught the gospel to a lot of them.
Yeah. So speaking of that sort of thing, teaching people. So the Sunday school movement actually began in the late 1700s with some Methodists that decided to open up a school for poor, uneducated children and to teach them. Sunday schools originally were specifically for children, especially for the poor children who were part of these urban factory manufacturing places who did not have time to be educated, or their parents neglected their education. And eventually the Sunday school movement expanded all across Great Britain and even in Scotland as well. There was a lot of social reform in Scotland through the church, through the body of Christ. And this was I want to make mention of the fact that Methodism played a huge role in this still. That the Methodists, although the Methodists they had a transitional period. They kind of split off into different groups. There was a group called the Primitive Methodists that split off from the main Methodist group. They kind of solidified their beliefs and their practices. Also in the 1800s, there was a holiness movement that kind of also was split off from formal traditional Methodism in order to emphasize the gifts of the Holy Spirit. Being baptized a second time with the Holy Spirit. But so let's go back to the Anglican Church and discuss the Anglican Church. It was still played a huge role during this time. And
actually, if I could, so kind of connected to this with Methodism, I'll even just say the evangelical movement. So when I say that, I mean like Methodism, Baptist, basically the non-Anglican.
Well, actually, there was an evangelical Anglican movement. Okay, which I was about to.
Anyway, so as we've talked about how poor these people were and what type of shape they were in, a lot of them lost interest in the Anglican Church. That you get the Anglican Church is more showy at the time, less about preaching, and actually looking more and more Catholic in a way, and. So a lot of these people have lost interest. They take 10% out of their, 10% of their money. And
really? Did they do the 10% thing?
Yeah, the tithe was state mandated.
Okay.
And so the evangelicals had a lot of success preaching to these poor people,
right,
and actually going to them, where the Anglican Church was more set up and didn't do that as much.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, in the early 1800s, they had difficulty creating new parishes. They had a lack of money because of the lack of people paying the tithe. They also had a lack of clergymen. So in 1843, an act of Parliament made the government actually passed an act in 1843 to create new parishes. In 1818, it voted to produce £1 million to build new church buildings, and £500,000 in 1824, so that they started building more churches, and over 2,000 churches were built between 1851 and 1875. Also, from 1841 to 1875, they raised up over 10,000 clergymen in that 30-year period. So they were trying to compete with the nonconformist denominations. They're trying to, increase their influence. But going back to the evangelical movement in the Anglican Church, that because of the influence, I believe, of the revival in the 1700s, a lot, in large part at least, there was a revival in the Anglican Church in the 1800s of Bible-believing, devout, especially preachers and pastors. For example, Charles Simeon, who was part of the Cambridge area, Cambridge University, he was a notable evangelical Anglican preacher in the early 1800s. He was actually largely persecuted and looked down upon by most of his Anglican, clergy peers at that time. But he stood as a beacon of evangelicalism in the Anglican Church. At the same time, there was also actually a movement to increase the Catholicism,
the Oxford movement,
of the Anglican Church. This was spearheaded by a man named John Henry Newman. It was actually called Tractarianism. Between 1833 and 1845.
Oh, can I just add something? Important for this and even for English history, I think it was maybe early 1830s or 1820s, they passed a law that allowed Catholics to be involved in Parliament. Before that, you weren't allowed to be involved. But basically, I think somebody from Ireland kind of like played their system in a way that he got voted in, got himself, somehow went around and got like written in on the ballot so that he won an election. But he was Catholic, and they're like, shoot. They're like, do we accept this? Because he's Catholic, we'd have to make a law for him to be allowed and let Catholics in, or do we say no and risk a revolt in Ireland? And so then they talked it through, and they're like, yeah, I guess we got to let him in. And there was a lot of fear that the Catholics would, basically ever since Bloody Mary, there's always been fear that the Catholics would take back over. And so there was a lot of trepidation with this decision. But at this point in the early 1800s, Catholics are now allowed to be involved in government again. So go ahead.
So John Henry Newman, along with some others. So John Henry Newman was a vicar of a church for Oxford University, and he, along with some others, they wrote some tracts, basically kind of bringing in Catholic ideas into the Anglican belief system and system of practice. There were 90 tracts, and basically the argument was that the truth of the doctrines of the Church of England rested on the modern church's position as the direct descendant of the church. This was Tractarianism. The idea that the Anglican Church, the reason that its beliefs and its teachings were true was because it represented the Apostolic Church.
Yeah.
In other words, you could go back to it. So that is the true modern representation of the original church.
Yeah.
And this kind of thinking, eventually in 1845, led John Henry Newman, the leader of this new movement within the Anglican Church, to convert to Roman Catholicism. So he became a Roman Catholic, and so now you have a former Anglican pastor who was a huge leader in the Anglican Church, is now a Roman Catholic, giving Roman Catholics, a representative for them to popularize.
Though I did hear that the Roman Catholics, there was another guy that followed after him that converted to Catholicism too in that movement, I think. Like one of the other, I don't know. But the Roman Catholics were not very big on these guys because, in a sense, their free thinking in Anglicanism had led them to Catholicism, and then when they became Catholics, they did not stop free thinking. And when I say I mean more like some doctrinal things that the Catholics were like, you really need to stick to what we say. But the point remains though that definitely there's this movement from some of the Anglicans towards making the Anglican Church more Catholic looking.
Right. It was called the Anglo-Catholic movement, alongside this evangelical movement. And then there was another small...
I was just going to say, so practically speaking, in the church, this means more towards show, more like the altar, the windows, like
incense,
the incense,
offering, also the fancy vestments, clothing for the priests.
Yeah.
different rituals.
Which in a way really fits the Victorian era, especially for the upper class that they were a lot about show. Think of I can't really think any like movies or anything off the top of my head, but if you picture the upper class Victorian England, like it's very dressed up, decked out, and very proper, saying all the right things, and that this is kind of right into that.
Yeah, and in the next half of the episode, we're going to discuss that proper, polite, refinement in manners as a result of the influence of evangelicalism, as well as the conflicts that happened through skepticism against Bible-believing Christianity. And also we're going to go to the other nonconformist movements, denominations. Want to touch on the missionary movement, and then the Baptist movement, especially with our man Charles Spurgeon.
Yeah.
So we'll take a break now and get back to you in just a bit. Hey, do you enjoy reading, studying the Bible, and learning how to become more like Jesus and what the message of the Bible is all about? Well, I have a Bible study blog called Bearing Christ Crucified and Risen. Its motto is to know Christ and Him crucified. I have hundreds of Bible studies and devotional articles, as well as book reviews. And there you can also check out my book, The New Covenant Answer to Western Christianity, Recovering and Applying the Apostles' Teaching on the Church. So if you're interested in that, please head over to bearingchrist.blog. That's bearingchrist.blog to know Christ and Him crucified. And we're back talking. I want to go back to the missionary movement that started with the Baptists, and specifically they were Calvinistic Baptists. Actually, we see in the 1800s most of the first missionaries were Calvinists, especially from America and Great Britain. Not to say that there weren't Methodist missionaries and other, Arminian type missionaries. And also another notable thing to mention is that the Anglican Church was not big into the missionary movement. It was the nonconformist denominations that were the pioneers in missions work, especially the Baptists, Presbyterians more in the United States. But speaking of just like home missions, actually in Scotland, even in the early 1800s, there were actually several small revivals in Scotland where the established church, the Church of Scotland, had a lack of preachers, and also preachers that did not believe the Bible. And so you had these evangelicals who were Bible-believing preachers, specifically two notable figures, James and forgot the other man's name. James and something Haldane, the Haldane brothers. They spearheaded a missionary movement in Scotland to reach people who didn't have the gospel, and they established Sunday schools in Scotland as well. Other notable figures in Scotland at this time were Horatius Bonar, Robert Murray M'Cheyne, and also Horatius Bonar's brother, who I can't think of his first name, but he was a Bonar as well.
Yeah, we'll call him Mr. Bonar.
Or Bonner, however you pronounce it. But for foreign missions, there is, because of imperialism, because the British Empire has so many colonies, there was a big opportunity for the nonconformist denominations to send out missionaries. So you have the Baptist Missionary Society already in the late 1700s that's formed. You also have another nonconformist missionary society more towards the early to mid 1800s that's formed in Great Britain. I forgot what it's called. But there was an influence between. There was a conflict between an opposition with going to the colonies to actually. There was a conflict between the government and missionaries a lot of times, because the missionaries were preaching the gospel and trying to educate these native people and to help them to be prosperous after they became Christians and believe the gospel. And that flew in the face of the imperial motives, which was to keep these people being poor, uneducated, basically slaves, so that you can use them in order to be workers for your factories.
And
things,
obviously
right?
this depended on, which aspect and which group of people. And there is a lot of hypocrisy is a strong word but as far as the English government and imperialism, where they do a lot of things that are not good, that hurt the Christian name. Not that it should. Not that the Christians going there weren't Bible believing Christians following the Lord, but just when they come and they're British.
Yeah.
And so in China you have the Opium War, where literally Britain wanted to sell opium to China, and they do, even illegally. China didn't want it, and millions and millions of Chinese get addicted to opium, and it's just crippling their society. And the Chinese government keeps begging the English government to please stop sending opium, you are ruining us.
Yeah.
And the English government looks like it makes us a lot of money. And so they keep doing it. That was what the war was over, because China's like, no, we're done, we're not accepting any. And Britain's like, oh, you're going to. And so they fight basically to get ports to trade opium. And so as far as looking at this as a morality thing, you're like, Britain is clearly just manipulating this country for money.
Right.
And doing, and so again, not that the missionaries had anything to do with this, but when a missionary comes from Britain to China at that point, a lot of Chinese people were not interested in dealing with the British person. Yeah, go ahead.
However, I don't. Hudson Taylor.
Yeah.
Was he an American or a British man?
I think he was British.
I'm pretty sure he was British. He went to China.
He did.
He was.
Yeah, and that doesn't mean there wasn't
the main 19th century missionary to China. There was a great revival actually through him, and he got a lot of people out of. I believe he got a lot of people out of opium addiction through his missionary.
Yeah,
work.
that doesn't mean individually there wasn't.
Right.
That God didn't use it and have successful areas.
Yeah.
Just is a large part in general. I think the conflict of imperialism with missionary work, they did contrast each other and not help each other.
Course. Right. Yeah.
But there was, William Carey in India was another one
Right.
you said. I'm trying to think if there was another one off the top of my head.
In India, or another British famous one.
Yeah, I'm not thinking of it. Go ahead.
That's okay. But regardless, besides those two notable missionaries, there were hundreds of missionaries that were sent out in the century to
David Livingstone.
Yeah, he went to Africa. Actually, he went to charter unknown parts of Africa and bring the gospel to them.
Yeah.
And he used this as a big thing to fund his effort. He was actually was he a scientist? Or maybe it was just like a land surveyor though.
Yeah.
And actually this was a huge thing in the British press, because he got lost there. No one knew where he was, and they actually sent out some organizations sent out a guy.
It was actually the New York Times
from
America
that's
sent
right.
somebody, because a lot of people figured he was dead, and they're like, no, if this guy's resourceful, if he could be, he's still alive. Go find him. Think of the story, and.
Yeah, and famously, when the man, I forgot what his name was. When the man actually eventually found David Livingstone, David Livingstone said to him, "Dr. So and So, I presume."
No, it was the other way. The guy said, "Dr. Livingstone, I presume." Just because he comes in and he sees
it's not as
this
interesting.
Aged white European in this tribe.
Right. Yeah. Okay. So missionaries in the places of the empire that were founded through imperialism.
Which I guess we should take a brief second to talk about imperialism. Britain was one of the. They were from colonization. A lot of the countries were European powers were trying to get as many resources as they could all over the world. Britain, as starting out the Industrial Revolution. Earlier, they had better ships. They could get faster. They had better warfare techniques, bigger guns. Their empire became the biggest as far as that goes. But so this was this whole notion of just finding these places for resources and this continues right up until World War I. Is one of the big causes of World War I. And as you get towards the second half of the 19th century in Britain, imperialism, colonization, the empire, these are big driving factors in British society.
Right. And that makes makes mainland Britain more prosperous, especially London. London is actually the largest, most prosperous city in the 1800s in Europe. Even more so than any city in the United States. It is an international hub, and it attracts Europeans from all around.
And actually, a lot of the American Industrial Revolution, was just feeding off of the Britain one. And you think like all the things we got from them, and even a lot of immigrants came from Britain to America. Like Andrew Carnegie was he Welsh or Scottish?
It sounds Scottish or
Irish.
Irish.
Yeah, I think it was Scottish, or it could be Irish. I don't remember. But he was right from Britain. He comes over, and so America was largely fueled by Britain. I did want to say too that the thing that Britain didn't have, their society was strange in that they did not value trading and business. They thought it was a lower class thing, because you see a lot of times where somebody gets really wealthy. Say if like you're a railroad tycoon in Britain, you get really wealthy. That means that you can have your kids be in the upper class of society, because the upper class was really, you were so wealthy you didn't have to work. And so that was their goal. And so unlike America, where if there's like a family that gets really wealthy at railroads, they just pass that on and say this is where it's at. But in Britain it was more of our goal is to get to a point where we don't have to work. And so the trading and business was actually viewed as a lower level profession, even though it was what was completely driving the whole economy and the whole country.
Interesting. Well, from that topic, let us finish, at least in a large part, by giving a brief survey of the conflict between biblical Christianity and skepticism at this time. Charles Darwin's Origin of the Species was published in 1859. He was a he was a former clergyman, and he becomes scientist, so-called, and he comes up with this idea that there is macro well, he doesn't really come up with it. He actually borrows it from someone previously to him. So he did not invent macroevolution. He just popularized it with this document that he wrote.
And I would say too, because he was very popular, and after publishing this, he was viewed by the British society as this gigantic intellect that lived among them. And like that was how they viewed him. Anyway, go ahead.
Yeah, I don't think he was that.
No,
that's as smart as they thought.
I would agree. I'm just saying that's how they.
But unfortunately, not only this, so this became popular among the general mass of the population. Eventually, it increased in popularity to such an extent that actually Bible-believing Christians were coming to the notion that we evolved from apes in the late 1800s. You also have higher criticism in the 1800s, especially in the Anglican Church. It's called the Broad Church movement, where they start viewing the scriptures not as a divinely inspired document, but something to be scrutinized according to human rationalist thinking, and they try to basically come up with their own stupid ideas about scripture. If
I could say one more thing about Darwin and evolution a little bit, was that you also have this feeling among the English, and then the American latch onto it too, of Anglican superiority. That the Anglicans are the race going forward.
You mean the English?
They call it the Anglican, but it's like that was what they called themselves. But yeah, basically
instead of British.
Yeah, well, like I said, the Americans latched onto this too, so they were calling it Anglican, and that we have Anglican bloodlines.
Oh.
But basically,
you don't mean Anglo?
They said Anglican.
So even the Americans call themselves Anglicans.
And more. It'd be
I thought that was only a word to describe those who were part of the Church of England.
I don't know. That was what I read. But basically, either way, that as these people with the English bloodlines, that this race here, the American, British, version,
English, Anglo-Saxon,
is the superior race going forward. And you see this through a lot of, the British, how they view the world, and then the Americans. I mean, I think like Teddy Roosevelt, Woodrow Wilson, they very much shared this Darwinian view that like we are the superior race going forward.
Yeah. Not true. Not so the Bible-believing Christians. The Bible-believing Christians, especially nonconformist denominations, grew largely in the 1800s. In 1851, there was a census that was taken in Great Britain. It said that out of a population of 18 million, 5.2 million attended Church of England services. That's a quarter of the population. But 4.9 million people in 1851 attended nonconformist denominational churches. They represented about half of the nation. So the Church of England saw that they were losing power. And so in the late 1800s, they actually abolished all religious requirements for attendance at universities, and also requirements for you to be a member of the Church of England to become a member of the government. And you see a rise of nonconformist figures, church leaders, especially Charles Spurgeon. Speaking of London, so he began his ministry in the 1860s, I believe. If not before that, it was at least the 1860s. If not,
I feel like it was a bit before that, but anyway, keep going. Though.
He didn't begin in London, but soon, because he was so popular as a preacher, he moved to London. They constructed the huge building. There was actually also a rise along with the building of Anglican church buildings or cathedrals. There was a huge uptick in the building of nonconformist places of meeting, especially Baptist places of meeting. And because it was the Victorian era and they had a lot of money, a lot of these, including Baptist church buildings, were very ornate and Gothic in style. Like, for example, the Metropolitan Tabernacle was the famous structure in which housed thousands of people, where Charles Spurgeon, for decades, from the 1860s to the 1880s, I believe he died in the late 1880s, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah,
but for decades, he preached to thousands of people in London. He was the most popular preacher in Great Britain and also in Europe in general. People went to him to hear his preaching.
And also in America. Mm-hmm. I mean, like, the Americans knew about him and were very enthralled.
Right. And so he's in London, which is the major center of Europe and of the Western world itself. And so his sermons were published. They were distributed across Europe and America. They were sold. His church organization, the Metropolitan Tabernacle, brought in tons of money, and so he actually established an orphanage. He established a Bible college for training pastors and preachers. He also funded many charitable organizations to help the poor in London and in society. So you have that huge bulwark of Bible-believing Christianity, especially. And he was a Calvinistic Baptist. We have to remember, this is the man. This is the man who led this great movement in the late 1800s to help the poor. However, there was a conflict. He was a member. His church was a member of the Baptist Union, which was a Baptist association that was founded in the early 1800s. This is when you start seeing the British Baptists form together in these associations. The Baptist Union began to have people who are promoting, false beliefs about Jesus, about his deity, and about the atonement of Christ, and about his salvation. And so he wrote against this. He preached against it, and he eventually had to leave the Baptist Union. And even his former students, at the end of his life in the 1880s, they turned against him. And this is one of the things that gave him great stress and probably led to his death at this time. So you have liberalism rising in the Baptist, even Calvinistic Baptist denominations. Liberalism rising in the Anglican Church. Liberalism rising in the Presbyterian churches in England, especially with Unitarianism. A lot of the Presbyterian churches became Unitarian at that time in the 1800s in Great Britain, and obviously in America as well, if you know that history. But in the late 1800s also, there was the rise of the Salvation Army, which was an offshoot of the Holiness Methodist movement, founded by William and Catherine Booth. In 1865, they started the East, I think it was called the East London Mission. Go ahead, my paper. Christian Revival Association. Sorry. So they started preaching evangelistically in London and other cities. They raised a large following, and eventually, so it's 5 years later, they began a food distribution program in London through Catherine Booth headed this. And actually, what they did was they used the British entertainment industry in order to like inspire their evangelistic campaigns. They rented out theaters and music halls in order to preach there to thousands of people, and they also went out on the streets to street preach. So they used music. They actually put evangelical biblical lyrics to popular English tunes. Bless you.
Thank you.
Yep. And then in the 1870s, 1878, they founded the Salvation Army, where they began to they pretended it was a military organization and basically based all their stuff on military type ideas, like their ranks had officer titles. William Booth was the general of the Salvation Army. The rank and file were called soldiers. New converts were called captives. And you had this whole hierarchical system. The mission stations were called corps, and eventually the Salvation Army spread not only to the other parts of the empire and also to America in the late 1800s. And but actually, they didn't begin their real social movements until the 1880s. In the mid 1880s, that's when they started, helping people to find jobs and helping the poor, trying to improve people's welfare. And by the end of the 1800s, the Salvation Army was basically, it's like one of the biggest evangelical social organizations, which unfortunately by the time of at some point in the 1900s, it lost the gospel and started just preaching morality, and they stopped preaching the true gospel. But that was a huge thing in the late 1800s in Great Britain as well. And then also liberalism also was it increased in the 1800s in the Anglican Church, and a stalwart leader against this was John. I think his middle name was Charles. J.C. he goes by Ryle, who was a bishop in the Anglican Church. He was basically one of the few evangelical Anglican bishops in the late 1800s, and he wrote against the liberalism that was creeping up in the Anglican Church, and he was a huge, prolific author that was popular at this time as well. Revivalism was kind of... revivalism, actually, unlike in the United States, was never a huge thing in the 1800s in Great Britain. Although D.L. Moody came to Britain in the late 1800s, especially in the 1870s, on at least a few tours preaching the gospel, and actually Charles Spurgeon encouraged him to do this. But revivalism, in that sense, the sense of like Charles Finney, that type of revivalism, never really gained traction in Great Britain. There were also small movements of evangelicals that arose in Great Britain, such as the Plymouth Brethren. Dispensationalism actually came out of the Plymouth Brethren movement. The Plymouth Brethren movement never actually got very big in England. By the height of its growth in the 1800s, it only had like 7,000 members of its movement. It was started by a former Anglican clergyman named John Darby.
Actually,
yeah,
I gotta disagree with that.
Mm-hmm.
So he joined it early.
Mm-hmm.
I don't believe he was like the founder, but he was one of the early members of it.
He was basically the main leader who like spearheaded it and popularized it.
He popularized it
because it was named the Plymouth Brethren movement when he went to Plymouth Plymouth
there
England
was
to preach.
there was not very far into it. There was a split between him and the other leaders, though.
Right.
But yeah, you continue.
Yeah, in 1847 to 49, that's when they divided. Darby became the leader of the exclusive brethren, where you would not allow unbelievers or people that didn't follow your group into to celebrate communion with you, and then the open brethren who did allow that to happen. But their main thing was going back to the New Testament's teaching on communion, the Lord's Supper. And also, they eventually became the spearhead group for focusing upon prophecy. And by the late 1800s, this dispensationalism that was eventually systematized through the influence of Schofield, whatever, I forgot what his first name. That was it was a worldwide in the English-speaking world, worldwide movement of prophecy, obsessing over prophecy and things like that.
And I would also say at the beginning of the Plymouth Brethren movement, a big portion of it was that that you don't need to be we don't really need the Anglican priest or preacher. That each person, each member Christian studying the Bible can provide good biblical teaching that way. And so that was kind of the foundation of it, that we and the movement away from having these official Anglican preachers, the clergy, and going away from the clergy.
Yeah, right. And actually, well, unfortunately, you don't really get that in any of the other denominations, except for maybe the Methodists and the Holiness movement, which did not emphasize formal educated and trained clergy or this professional class of preachers. So you have evangelism going on by the late 1800s through especially the Salvation Army, the Methodists, and even the skeptics, even those who are pro-science and anti-Bible, they still gave sympathy to the evangelicals, to Bible-believing Christians, because it improved society so much through the Christian leaders, through the Christian organizations, the helping the poor, helping the labor problem.
And I would say at first, for quite a while, there was people that were into like evolution and seeing that the Bible isn't literal. Mm-hmm. They didn't equate that to the Bible isn't true, or that Christianity is wrong. A lot of people, some people did, but a lot of people just held both beliefs, and didn't really see it as an issue at first.
Right. Yeah, but so to wind up the 1800s, at least what I have learned, because so by this time Great Britain was very prosperous. There were lots of labor laws passed. Labor was actually.
And with the labor laws, you really get the labor unions movement, mm-hmm. and that moved to America, which probably most people listening to this would know about.
Right. So actually, there are tons of converts in the 1800s. There are more people that are truly Bible-believing Christians by the late 1800s as compared to the early 1800s in Great Britain, and also a rise in the population in general because of the prosperity of the nation, providing for food and things like this. And so by the early 1900s, a lot of people were thinking was we are reaching a period of history in which there will be no more war. We'll live in harmony with one another. We'll be a utopia. We'll all get along in Europe, and we are. By this time, unfortunately, there was a nominal Christianity that had really been popularized. That if you were a member of British society, you were a Christian, and that was in large part because there were so many true Christians that were saved during the time period, and so many people who are interested and sympathetic towards biblical Christianity, but. So those hopes were shattered, obviously, by World War I in 1914, and also by liberalism, which grew at this time as well and corrupted the denominations, like we saw with the Baptists, with the Anglicans, with the Presbyterians. Yeah. So liberalism, the social gospel, also rose up in the early 1900s, rose its ugly head.
Which I would say too, just as a modern warning to us looking back through history, liberalism is always a danger.
Right.
There's always that natural tendency for the church. When I say that, I don't necessarily mean the actual church. For for people in the church to tend toward liberalism, to tend away from biblical Christianity, and so to constantly be watching out for that.
And that's why the fundamentalist movement began in the early 1900s,
Yeah.
especially in America, and also in smaller part in Great Britain. And this is not to say this Christianity ceased in the early 1900s, but it was not. So basically, the climax of evangelical Christianity in Great Britain was the late 1800s, especially with men like Charles Spurgeon, J.C. Ryle, and I'm sure there were others that we don't even know about. But any lessons we should learn?
One thing I was thinking was just, so with Great Britain here, you see them being so prosperous, so in every aspect, in building the empire, in technology, in all these things, and they were very excited about this, and so looking at what happened with them and applying that to our lives is to not get overly excited about progress that really doesn't have to do with with biblical Christianity, to lose ourselves in saying like, oh, see how far. I mean, even like we just had an election politically, to be like, oh, if you're a conservative, the Republicans have taken back, the country. Is like not to get too excited about that stuff, because that's not biblical Christianity.
Right.
It maybe it'll lead to good things, but or if there's technological advances or whatever it is, not to lose ourselves in those things, but to keep ourselves founded on the truth of the Word.
Right. I wanted to read a Bible verse that I think characterizes well biblical Christianity in Great Britain during the 1800s. James 1:27, a very famous verse. In the ESV, it says, "Religion that is pure and undefiled before God the Father is this: to visit orphans and widows in their affliction, and to keep oneself unstained from the world." I think that's what the biblical Christians did in Great Britain during that time. So we should learn from their example, to go all out for the Lord. We live in a different society, obviously, but we have more opportunities now than ever to be a light in the dark world that is humanistic, atheistic, transhumanistic, secularist, and anti-God and anti-Christian. So preach the gospel. Look to these great examples of history that spearheaded the advancement of the kingdom of God, and make disciples of all nations, and just be faithful to what the Lord has called you to do, and the Lord will be with us to the end of the age. So until next time, thank you for listening to the King's Hand in History podcast. Don't know what we're going to cover next time, but we'll find out. The Lord is in control. Until next time, thanks for listening again, and God bless.